Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nancy, for that nice introduction. As Nancy told you, my work has been about connecting what we know from the science of learning to educational practice, and I feel very passionately that our educators need to know how children think and learn and need to be able to apply that in educational settings. So I've done that largely through the brain-targeted teaching model, which was a model that I designed actually about 10 years ago when I was a school principal, which is what you haven't heard about me, before I came to Johns Hopkins, and a doctoral student at Johns Hopkins University. So let's see, there we go. So at Hopkins, the NeuroEd initiative is really looking to do three big things. One is to, well, it won't go back, there we go. What do we know from neuro and cognitive sciences that teachers should know and be applying on a regular basis? Next, what do we need to know? What are the best areas of translational research? How do we go from the bench to bedside approach like they do in medicine? And then finally, how do we move this information into instructional practice? And those are some really pretty big things, and I think you'll be hearing a lot today from many of us, some commonalities in that work. Okay, so here's a picture of, the top picture is Dr. Charles Lim, and I think that I'm seeing something different from there and there, so let's try to, there we go. Yep. Well, I will talk about Dr. Charles Lim, even though you're not seeing him here on the behind. There we go. Okay. So Dr. Lim, if you don't know his work, how many of you know Dr. Lim's work? Okay, good. Some of you do. You'll be seeing his video later today, his TED Talk. Dr. Lim works with me. He's our director of research for the NeuroEd initiative, but he's also an otolaryngologist for the Hopkins School of Medicine and is internationally known for his work in creativity, fMRI studies using improvisation, looking at that with jazz musicians. And below, that's me as a school principal out in the playground with my children. Now, back in those days, I don't think I ever thought that I would be working with an fMRI researcher, and I don't think Dr. Lim ever thought he would be sitting in the principal's office. And my office still looks very much like a principal's office. But together we work on, again, bringing brain research to educators, and we're very fortunate at Hopkins to have all of the different schools and units working together. There are about 540 brain researchers at Hopkins in various fields, and coming together, the faculty coming together to inform this work has been pretty powerful for us. And as was mentioned before, the Mind, Brain, and Teaching certificate, both online and face-to-face, is a way that we disseminate this. So I'm going to kind of step back a little bit and then talk to you about what is 21st century teaching and learning. I like to look at it through three lenses. The first is, what do we teach children? What are we teaching children? And we spend so much time now, and especially now, looking at content standards, right? So those Common Core standards is really just dominating a lot of professional development right now in school districts. The next box, the gray area, I made it gray on purpose, is what have students learned? And for the last 10 years, we've been obsessed with that, haven't we? Data-driven everything, high stakes accountability testing. But the last box is one in which I think we have really neglected in our field, and that is, how do students best learn? And that's really where my work is, and it is my passion, and that is what, again, can we learn from the science of learning so that teachers know how all children best learn. So The term brain-based learning came about probably more than 10 years ago, and one of my esteemed colleagues, brilliant man at Hopkins, said to me, brain-based learning? And this was his exact quote, isn't all learning brain-based? After all, we don't think with our feet. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, you know, you're right. Brain-based is probably not a great term to describe learning. But I said to him, you know, while all learning is brain-based, all teaching does not result in learning. So while all learning is brain-based, all teaching is not. Therefore, my work has been to look at teaching targeted to how the brain best thinks and learns. And I have looked long and hard for the ugliest foot I could find for that picture. And I have to tell you, eventually I didn't have to look far. So, the brain-targeted teaching model is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. It's an instructional framework. It's a way that I used with my teachers, and now as I work with teachers in various places, it is a way to pull together a framework that is a unifying way to pull together a lot of the information that you're probably going to be hearing today. And so I'm going to get right into it and start with the emotional climate for learning, which really maps very tightly into the talk you just heard. And that is the importance of the emotional climate. You know, I've heard teachers say to kids, you know, your emotions get left at the door. You know, we're about learning in this room. Leave your emotions at the door. But we now know from neurocognitive science that we can't do that. We think through the lens of our emotions. And we're learning more and more about stress and how it impedes learning, actually even changing brain structures. And the more recent research coming out about poverty and how it affects stress and how that affects brain structure. This is important information for us to have the knowledge of and to be able to really think about as we teach children. We also know, though, that positive emotions are being shown to actually help learning, to have children think in broader ways, more global understanding. So, you know, the idea is how do we make our environments, we heard again in our last talk, how do we make these environments more conducive to learning? So what's frightening to me is a study not too long ago that said that most kids are reporting that of all of the emotions they feel in school, the top one is anxiety. So as we work with teachers, we get them to think about something, and I love this quote from Jo Bolt-Taylor in her book, A Stroke of Insight. Although many of us think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, biologically, we are feeling creatures that think, and we've got to think about that every day when we have our children in front of us. So I'm going to be showing you planning templates, but as we work with teachers to get them to put this content that I've just talked about into practice, we look at a variety of ways that they can, on a daily basis, and every time they design a learning unit in the brain-targeted teaching model, that they revisit some of these best strategies that you'll be seeing in our planning templates as we move along. And teachers really purposefully planning for how to make that environment better. Okay, the next target then is the physical learning environment. And here we look at how we use that physical environment for really triggering attention in children. That attention is a big part of learning, as we know. It is the filter. So how do we use novelty in the environment? We're learning more and more about the effect of novelty. You know, I've gone in classrooms and every part of the walls are covered, and those posters are up the first day of school and they come down the last day of school. And nothing changes in that environment. So it becomes like wallpaper for the children. They don't see those anymore. So we look at that, novelty, how do we change the classroom? We also look at physical features in the environment, lighting, sound, even scent, and movement. How do we make sure that the classrooms allow children to move around a little bit? And then finally, order and beauty. How do we make the classrooms places where children really want to come and learn? So I couldn't resist in showing you the school cafeteria of my former school, Roland Park Elementary Middle School, where we tried to use every wall we could as a place of beauty. I'm going to show you pictures of stairwell. This actually was the biggest used stairwell in the school because it led to the cafeteria from the 3rd floor. Now, the stairwell, which was just cinder blocks, was full of streaks of yellow and red. So if you can imagine the packets of mustard and ketchup, you'll know what was going on in those hallways. But when we put these beautiful vistas in the hallways instead, these are the seasons of the year, not only did that kind of behavior stop, but instantly the hallways got very quiet. It felt like children were really enjoying the vistas instead of seeing cinder block, of seeing a vista of a beautiful field. So we've worked really hard to think about what can we do within classrooms, and as a school leader, what can we do within the schools? The physical environment speaks to our children, it speaks to our community, and we have to be very purposeful about that environment. The next target is brain target 3, and that is now planning our unit. So we've talked about our physical and our emotional environment. Now let's think about planning that learning unit. Here in brain target 3, we think about Bransford's idea of knowledge really being about big picture thinking and big ideas. Typically, that's not the way educators think. We go objective by objective. We go unit by unit, and we think that the kids will pull it together somehow on their own. Here instead, we say to the teachers, think about your unit holistically, and let's provide children with a big picture idea before we even begin teaching the unit. So think of it this way. If you were to do a jigsaw puzzle, but you never saw the picture, the individual pieces wouldn't make as much sense. So here's an example of a teacher who used the model, and she was teaching the novel Hatchet to children and came up with 3 big ideas that the children would be studying in the novel Hatchet, and then showed the children what activities they would be doing to connect to those big ideas, and then what the culminating evaluation would be. So as children were learning this unit and studying the novel, they were constantly able to go back and reflect on those big ideas. So here again in our planning units, we ask the teachers to look at their content standards and the learning goals and have children personalize goals and design graphic organizers that children can continue to embellish as they're doing the unit, constantly bringing them back, though, to the big ideas and the big picture. And teachers who have used this have been amazed at how it helps to embed learning and memory for the content they're teaching. So now next, we've planned our units, and now we move to the core of teaching, and that is teaching for mastery. We want children to master, obviously, what we teach them, skills, content, and concepts. So I'm going to go to a cartoon, and here my friend says, hey, Claire, guess what? I taught our pet hamster to whistle. And she thinks about it, and she says, no way, our pet hamster can't whistle. And he says, no, silly. I said, I taught it. I didn't say he learned it. Now, isn't that typical of what happens in education a lot? I taught the kids. In my experience, I would have my middle school teachers blame the elementary teachers for not having taught the kids their math facts, for example. And then the high school teachers would blame the middle school teachers. And now that I'm at the university level, I hear university professors blaming high school teachers. So I think, though, what it's about is that we are really too focused in an inch deep and a mile wide curriculum and we move students quickly through the content because we have to get through it. And we're not giving children enough time to embed in memory what they need to have for mastery. So like twin stars, learning and memory are connected, right? Learning is acquisition of knowledge, and memory allows that knowledge to be used at a later time and to be recalled. Now, we know from research that there are a few things that really embed memory, and one is just plain old repetition and rehearsal, and the other is certain kinds of elaborations. So, as I said again, we're moving so quickly through what we're teaching children that we're not allowing enough time for repetition and rehearsal or elaborations. Now, my postdocs and I have written a paper recently where we argue that many of the memory effects that we know of through neuro and cognitive science that allows children to repeat and rehearse and elaborate on information is really done naturally through the arts. So I've been a very strong proponent from the time I started an arts integration program as a principal of my school, and now at the university level researching arts integration. We believe that the arts are a very natural way for children to be able to take the content that they've learned, maybe through traditional ways, and move it into more elaborative ways. And it's just plain fun for children too. And we believe that we have measures that show heightened engagement as well when children are learning through the arts. So once again, we give teachers, as they're planning a unit, different indicators of how they can take those major objectives that they want the children to learn, not just for the test, but to know, to be able to use at the end of the year or next year. What are those memory triggers that will allow children to really master content? Now, once children have learned information, are we done teaching? And the answer is no. Children have to be able to apply knowledge meaningfully. And 21st century learning is really about applying knowledge in creative kinds of ways, in creative thinking and creative problem solving. So the next part of our model looks at what's the research on creative thinking. And what we're finding is that through really recent fMRI studies, and you'll hear a little bit more about that with Charles Lim, that the brain is processing information differently when it's involved in more creative kinds of thinking tasks than ordinary tasks. And the different neural networks are at work. We talk about something called adaptive expertise, and that is when children acquire knowledge, but then they're able to use that knowledge in ways that further their own learning. So examples of having children in the last picture, children were learning about area and perimeter, and they then designed a garden, or high school students learning about genetics and actually building. So once again, different neural networks are at work, and we believe that children need to have constant repetition with that. So in our planning template, there are two things that I've highlighted in red that I think are really critical here as teachers plan these units. And one is to give children opportunities not just to check A, B, C, or D, or fill in the blank, but to allow open-ended divergent questions and to build that more and more into our instructional practice. And then finally, to really take information and put it right into real world context. The final target is brain target 6, and that's evaluating learning. And we believe that evaluation really goes hand in hand with learning. And there's some features that we think about with evaluation. One is feedback, relevant feedback and the right kind of feedback. Two, active retrieval of information, having children actively retrieve and letting them know that research is showing that just passive studying is really not as effective as having them actively retrieve. And that doesn't mean just a test. It can be through projects as well. Spacing. A lot of information has come out about how we revisit and we evaluate on space-time intervals. And then finally, using the arts as a way to evoke emotion and being creative, allowing teachers and children to be creative in what they learn. So our next slide shows an example of that. The teacher used the typical book mid-chapter review to assess her children's knowledge of measurement, and then decided to do it in a more creative way. And so she had the children think about a farm and think about what animals they wanted to put on their farm, and then what size the pens needed to be. And that's how she evaluated their learning in that unit. And then, of course, she gave them a rubric so they knew ahead of time what they were going to be responsible for, and they could self-assess. So that's the brain-targeted teaching model in a nutshell. The research is much deeper than that. The first book that I wrote in 2003 is on the left, Connecting Brain Research with Effective Teaching. And on the right, any minute is coming out, and that's Brain-Targeted Teaching for 21st Century Schools by Corwin Press. And you'll find in that book many, many vignettes that teachers who have used the model have shown and how it has made them effective teachers. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope to dialogue with you later.